So now we're all wondering how real IoT is. How much is it going to affect us in our day-to-day lives? What are the touch points going to be for that? And our next speaker promises to tell us, is it really real? Piers Hogarth-Scott is the national practice leader in the Internet of Things at KPMG Australia, where he has a particular focus on smart cities, smart education, and smart agriculture. These are areas that touch every one of us. Please welcome Piers.
Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is a bit about how IoT is going to transform the Australian way of life over the next 10, 20 years or so. And what I'm going to ask you to do is to step back from, I guess, the day-to-day operational pressures and open up your mind to what a vision of the future might look like, and to think about how this could ultimately impact all of our lives. The innovation that we've seen around the doublings of technology over the last 50 years or so, which has been really incredibly significant if you think about how that's just simply accelerating as time goes on. And of course, as we all know, that's been driven by a number of innovations in terms of the decreased cost of compute, the massive increase of bandwidth, decreased cost of bandwidth, and so on and so forth. And of course, there's a sort of core confluence of innovation in technology. A lot of it underpinned by IoT. So, artificial intelligence, blockchain, 3D printing, quantum computing coming down the line. We are in a perfect storm of innovation as it relates to technology and ultimately technology disruption. And Steve Kotler describes this exponential disruption, if you like, across the 6 Ds. So let's think about the first one being digitization. So this is where technology becomes exponential once it's digitized. So once you can turn something into ones and noughts. So think about from printed photos into iPhoto or digital photos, and how we're exponentially able to share those photos with our friends and family and further once they're digitized. The second D is around deception. So what always follows digitization is deception. And this is where a period of exponential growth largely goes unnoticed. And it happens because the doubling of numbers, of relatively small numbers, can appear as linear growth. So you think about early digital cameras and megapixels, and growing from 0.02 to 0.04 to 0.08. To the uninitiated, we're just seeing lots and lots of zeros. It appears to be linear growth. But when you get to whole numbers, that growth can dramatically grow on an exponential basis, 2 to 4 to 8 to 16. Before you know it, you're at 32,000. And you think about a chessboard. If you put 1 grain of rice on the first square of the chessboard and double it every single square, by the time you get to by the time you've filled up the whole board, you've got millions of grains of rice on that board. A good example, of course, of deception is Uber. Where did Uber come from? To consumers on the street, it appeared to suddenly arrive overnight out of nowhere and disrupt the taxi industry. Democratization. Okay, so democratization is really about where, through technology disruption, technology is provided on a ubiquitous basis outside of simply governments, corporations, very wealthy individuals. It is available to absolutely everyone. Think about how that then expands into ultimately the vanishing of money as well. Think about how the goods that we used to buy, cameras, video conferencing units,
radio sets, so on and so forth, now all sit within the power of your palm, if you like, the power of your hand in a smartphone. Think about how that ultimate sort of democratization, if you like, makes it available to absolutely everybody. Here's a good example of what I was talking about in terms of the smartphone. You look at the value of the various items in a smartphone. It's about $1 million worth of that value, which is really driving that demonetization and dematerialization aspects that Kotler talks about in the 6Ds. And that then, of course, leads on to the ultimate disruption. You know, disruptive technology creates new markets simply because they're often a better experience. It's a better product, it's a better user experience. Think about the winners and losers that we've seen out of this process as well. The hotels to Airbnb, the DVDs to Netflix, so on and so forth. And this whole these disruptive forces are simply multiplying and magnifying and getting faster and faster. To the extent where they're beginning to disrupt the world on a monumental scale. The chair of the World Economic Forum, of course, coined the phrase the Fourth Industrial Revolution as being the confluence of all of those technologies underpinned largely by IoT. Some of these technologies are approaching maturity and how we interact with them as humans on the planet. So what I'm going to try and do is unpack some of those across a couple of sectors, and particularly think about how they're going to impact the Australian way of life over the next 10, 20 years. And we'll bring that back to home first by thinking about my kids. So 3 of the kids up there on that photo are mine, as you can see, they're all surfing mad. Jasper on the left, Jasper's 13 years old today, and Anna on the far right, she's 9 years old. So what we're going to try and do is project to the sort of world that they're going to come into when they enter adulthood. And we think about, you know, Jasper in sort of 7 years' time, and maybe Anna in 14 years' time, and how the world's going to change around them. So Jasper will probably have access when he's 20 years old. It's only 7 years away. To perfect knowledge. There'll be 3 billion more people online to interact with. He could, if he wants to, choose not to own a car. And he could, if he wants to, choose not to have a driving license. He'll be able to sequence his genome for less than $10 and buy a home PC for $1,000 that's equal to the processing power of his brain. Now let's think about my daughter in 14 years' time, when she's 23 years old, and what sort of environment she'll come into as an adult. She'll probably have a shadow brain, a shadow AI brain that she's able to recall to and ask questions to, and ask her to draw up or repeat conversations that she had years ago with mum or dad or with her friends. You know, think about how the efficiencies that can drive versus right now, if somebody asks you, do you recall that conversation you had or that correspondence that you had, and you need to go through your notes and it takes time to find it, she'll be able to call it up instantly. It's more than likely that she won't be allowed to drive on a freeway. That'll be far too unsafe for humans. Hopefully she'll still be able to drive on arterial roads and out in the bush. She'll have artificial intelligence for a GP. GPs will play a much higher order at the more sophisticated levels of medicine, and as such will be largely in charge of a certain baseline of her own health. And the toilet will probably be the most connected room in the household, providing her with health advice, telling her that her sugar levels are too high, detecting cancer before it turns into a problem, so on and so forth. Okay, so now we've thought about how that's going to impact my kids as they enter adulthood. Let's look at 2 or 3 key sectors, starting with smart cities. So
Previous presenters have talked about the stack that they see it as it relates to IoT, and this is a pretty similar construct in terms of the physical infrastructure, sensors and actuators, connectivity and device management, security and privacy, data orchestration, and of course, smart applications. Buildings as well, it's quite remarkable how instrumented buildings are today. I mean, our building in Barangaroo is one of the most instrumented buildings in Australia. There are millions and millions of sensors essentially automating processes and providing predictive maintenance. Because of course what IoT is largely about is connecting the physical world with the digital world. And what's happening around us is the mass instrumentation of absolutely everything: buildings, roads, lampposts, even oceans. The lamppost is increasingly becoming critical digital infrastructure. I was at a meeting of Lord Mayors in Adelaide some months ago, about 15 Lord Mayors, whose collective view is that the lamppost is absolutely mission critical digital infrastructure, and they're all seeking to take ownership of that infrastructure away from the energy operators who traditionally own it, or indeed to install their own. Okay, second sector we're going to look at is transport. And what might this look like in the next decade or so? Possibly the end of car ownership to a certain extent. Maybe autonomous vehicles will only be allowed on the main roads. Perhaps car rental companies don't exist. Taxi companies might not exist. And think about the reallocation and the rezoning of parking spaces down the street, parking spaces in buildings. What might it look like over the next decade or two in terms of the overall sector? Well, maybe we're going to have just some key autonomous vehicle fleet operators, maybe only a limited number of maintenance players. It could well become so cheap and ultimately regulated like electricity, and the preferred mode of transport because it's just safer and cheaper than flying, for example. Another consideration, of course, is the amount of time that it's going to free up. Rather than sitting behind a wheel driving, by some measures, some 400 hours. Organisations today are thinking about how can they capitalise on that. What opportunities does that open up from a retail point of view, from financial services, from entertainment? Organisations today are already investing in developing products and services to take advantage of this opportunity that's coming down the line. We all know about Hyperloop or heard of Hyperloop, the trials that are about to take place in the Middle East. Imagine if we had Hyperloop between Sydney and Newcastle. I was up in Newcastle on Monday. I got the train. It took me 2.5 to 3 hours to get there. Imagine if you had Hyperloop so that we could get between Sydney and Newcastle in 10 or 15 minutes, and the impact that would have on housing affordability, for example. Okay, we're going to talk about the next sector, which is education, and the impact that IoT is having in this area. Concepts around augmented reality, virtual reality, gamification, immersive environments that enable teachers and students to not have to rely on two-dimensional textbooks, but actually to help transport them virtually to the other side of the world or to another era, to actually immerse them in that environment and enhance the overall learning experience. This is one such example today of augmented reality, where effectively, obviously, dissecting the human body, and the ability to look at it from a three-dimensional point of view, and actually manipulate it as you go around it. And the opportunity that presents from a learning perspective.
Okay, so your teacher's going to take you to a different shark, a different place, see what you can find. Whoa.
his kid's just been transported off to London to go and see Big Ben, or Paris to go and see the Eiffel Tower, or even to go and see the dinosaurs in another era. These immersive experiences are really transforming how students learn. I was at Curtin University in Perth last week, and it's quite remarkable. They've moved from a what they would call a teaching to a learning environment. They've got rid of lecture halls, much like this one, where you have the traditional staged seating and then you have a lecturer at the front. They've got rid of that whole sort of preaching scenario, and instead now have completely open plan seated arrangements where the lecturer will sit in the middle of the room. They're fully VC-enabled audio conferencing lecture halls, where you've got half the people sitting in the room interacting with the lecturer. You've got the other half, or another quarter, sitting outside in the sun on beanbags, streaming the lecture live on their iPad, and you've got the other quarter of people who aren't on campus at all. So I think that we're going to see some very significant transformation in education continue. The final one we're going to talk about is of course, the home. An area that's been gaining significant traction today. I mean, of course, a couple of months ago we had Google Home launch, Telstra and its home product. But let's think about how the home's going to transform over the next 10 years or so. Things like sensors applied to kitchen workbenches, whereby you apply you put your hot cup of coffee down on the bench. The sensor applies heat to it to keep it warm, or conversely, if it's a cool drink, applies refrigeration. Think about your sitting room and your entertainment center, if you like, and the ability to immerse yourself in a 3D environment to go off and see the Pink Floyd concert at the London O2 Arena rather than actually leaving home. Think about waste management and the advice that your waste units are going to be able to provide to you to optimize and reduce that waste management. Think about the opportunity also for the work environment. People will quite likely have very different work scenarios at that point in time. And of course, we've also talked about the connected bathroom and the opportunities for health advice around that as well. So thank you very much. Hopefully that's provided a bit of a vision as to what I think we're going to see down the line.